Hello, my name is Courtney B. Vance. This is a wonderful moment in my life and for our audience. I would like to introduce Professor David Levering Lewis
Hello, I'm David Levering Lewis.
and Christina Rooney to our audio audience.
Hi there.
And I would like to set the stage for the discussion that Christina and I are going to have with Professor Lewis about his two Pulitzer Prize winning biographies about the seminal personality, Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois. I am a voracious reader, listener of big biographies, and I have had both volumes of Professor Lewis's Pulitzer Prize winning biographies, Biography of a Race and The Fight for Equality and the American Century, on my shelf for 30 years, waiting for someone to do the audio version of the book. Every year or so, I check with Amazon to see if someone had done the audio version. And a couple of years ago, I went to my alma mater, Harvard's commencement, to support my friend Tom Hanks, who was delivering the commencement address. At the honorary doctorate dinner the night before, I was wonderfully surprised to see that Professor Lewis was to receive an honorary doctorate as well. I was very excited, but somehow that night and at the festivities after the commencement the next day, I missed my opportunity to ask him why there was no audio version of both volumes. So afterwards, I had my reps track him down, and he told me there was no audio version in 1993 or 2000 when both volumes were released. Then Professor Lewis asked me if I wanted to record the books. I said that that was not why I had reached out to him, but in that instance, I recognized that this was a very pivotal moment in my life, and I said yes. About 7 years ago, I met Professor Neil deGrasse Tyson at Yale, where he, along with my wife, Angela Bassett, were receiving honorary doctorates. Shortly thereafter, I received an email from Professor Tyson asking me to narrate his towering book on astrophysics and the military. It's called Accessory to War. And I agreed, not knowing anything about the very dense topic. Well, my wonderful director, Christina Rooney, literally took me by the hand and walked me through the process of narrating the book. And right then and there, I knew I would only work with her on any subsequent books I narrated. And that brings us to this wonderful moment today where I sit with these two brilliant, wonderful people and dear friends to have a discussion about Professor Lewis's masterful W.E.B. Du Bois biographies. But one cannot separate the brilliant man from the times in which he lived, where the United States was literally figuring out on the fly, not very well, I might add, how it was to deal with the African Americans post-slavery and post-Reconstruction. And W.E.B. Du Bois was the chief architect of that journey. Professor Lewis, Christina and I have so many questions for you. And Miss Christina was so very kind as to distill them down to the talented 11. I borrowed the phrase from you, of course. But after being inside the world of your book for almost a month, we'd like to pick your brain for a while, if that's all right. Professor Lewis, W.E.B. Du Bois advocated for the idea of the talented 10th to pave the way for the elimination of the color line, because Black excellence would be undeniable. Where do you see this idea still resonating in American culture today?
The idea of the talented 10th was once considered somewhat elitist, and that resulted in some criticism that its serviceability was limited. But we have, I think, learned that the statement that those who have advantages are also obliged to serve and to lead in ways that benefit the great mass of people. And I think this is still the case, that those people who have credentials or who have demonstrated talent are under an obligation to be useful not only to themselves and to a class of people, but to the great majority of humanity. And in speaking of the great majority of humanity, we're speaking of both people of color, people who lack color, people who have perhaps too much color, people who are underprivileged, and people who are indifferent to their privileges. It is an idea that Du Bois discovered was even implicit in Marxism, where a small group of people indoctrinated properly in the tenets of Marxism were obliged to guide and to succeed. And so the idea of excellence and obligation are twinned and remain so in the conception of a Du Boisian scholar. And I think that if you appreciate the fact that humility is a necessary component of advantage, and that empathy is also a necessary component of advantage, then you see that people who have some excellence and some advantage really are the servants of the great mass of humanity and should be. Now, he changed his views as time went on, of course. And in the second volume, I think we will discover that he said something that quite astonished a great assembly of the talented 10th in about 1948. But that takes us on into the future, and I can abide that moment later.
Professor Lewis, I wonder if you can talk to us a little bit more about how the focus on the talented 10th maybe neglected the power in widespread solidarity and inclusivity. How did he move towards an idea of inclusivity, an idea of solidarity, perhaps as part of his move towards Marxism over time?
It's quite true that the talented 10th construct did seem to be limited. It seemed to be embedded in an elitist construct, which Du Bois indeed accepted early on. It's remarkable how often he would say that the idea that we need voting rights is indeed something that is controversial, he would say early on. He said, if you have people who are worthy of the vote, why, then there's no issue about giving them the rights. They will exercise them. Well, that seems bizarre today, of course, because voting rights become, as the years go by, the essential position of Du Bois and the movement that he first created, the Niagara movement, made up of elitist African Americans, and then of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, made up of a much larger group, and yet still a group that defined itself in terms of advantage and in terms of literacy and what have you. He, though, as the years pass, decides that idea of talent and elitism is insufficient. And that happens, I guess in the 1930s, and that's another book, but it comes about when Du Bois himself decides that really the academy itself is insufficient for changing the whole view of people racially. In 1899, something happens to Du Bois, a terrible moment of lynching that stunned him so. A man named Sam Hose had been taken away, butchered, and killed. And he was so appalled by this that he left Atlanta University, which sat on a mountaintop interestingly enough, walking down Mitchell Street with a note of complaint to give to the publisher of the Atlanta Constitution. But he saw on a storefront the remains of Sam Hose and was so appalled by it that he turned back and went back to his classroom and said, "This is," as he looked back, "this was the moment when I realized that I had to become part of a much larger movement, a more active movement, and one that was based on the needs of the people themselves." It will take some time, though, before Du Bois becomes consistent and embeds himself really in the kind of solidarist movement that will gain great power through numbers and through the willingness of people to follow him to the barricades of racism and to press forward.
How did that work set the stage for later civil rights leaders like Medgar Evers, MLK, and Malcolm X?
This puts us into the period of the 1960s, at least. And by that time, Du Bois had become convinced that American democracy was so impregnated by capitalism that it could never serve the great mass of Americans, white, black, and poor. That view, which he advocated with great eloquence in publications, soon became a common wisdom on the part of young people and of more militant people. And so you could hardly imagine a march on Washington in August of 1963 and a Du Bois dying on the eve of that great assembly of some 250,000 people. You could not imagine the one happening without the other. And so it seems to be, in a kind of cinematic way, the significance of his gradual solidarism is illustrated in this great moment when the United States comes to a point where civil rights legislation, the first since Reconstruction days, is necessary. And so the complementarity of these men that you mentioned and women and Du Bois, it seems to me, is illustrated almost cinematically in August of 1963. Martin Luther King, with the baton of civil rights being passed, as it were, to him, having all of the background that would make his words so electric.
Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. were seemed to be at cross purposes. We could potentially come together, but there's these forces that were making sure that the two of them stayed apart. The battle lines were drawn, and it just seems like we grown at all? Are we still have these forces that are trying to keep us apart?
We certainly do, of course. Today, it seems, is particularly illustrative of forces that I think we would have waved aside and said 10 years ago that the movement was in a direction of diversity and inclusion and equity. And no one could say that with certitude today. Remarkably, what has happened in the blink of a November eye is retrogression and a kind of kleptomania, which is simply aggressive capitalism that underfunds, resists, and destroys the opportunities, medical and educational and occupational, of the promise of our democracy. Du Bois would I think, have been stupefied almost by the relapse that we are dealing with today. Unfortunately, or fortunately, it may be that the extremism of the current American politics, domestic politics, guarantees a reaction that will not only involve African Americans and people of color and migrants, it will involve a vast number of people who, for various reasons, see that the cost of the paradigm that Project 2025 offers is unacceptable, repugnant, and indeed absurd. All of that may happen. And if so, Du Bois would say, as he did say, as he left for Ghana in 1961, he said that capitalism could not reform itself. Perhaps, though, he would now look upon the problem that capitalism has caused as a global phenomenon that indeed is quite conducive to a global solidarity.
Can you talk to us about W.E.B. Du Bois's dealings with women, specifically the tension between his progressive push for women's political rights and his fraught personal relationships with women?
A biographer writes about what he finds to be pleasant and to cheer him on, but he also acknowledges deficits. And there are some with W.E.B. Du Bois, particularly in the sphere of his treatment of women. But it's a curious paradox, because if you were to read Dark Water, a book that appeared in 1920, full of essays and intuitive riffs, you would read The Damnation of Women, which is perhaps the most passionate, the most eloquent, the most unequivocal endorsement of women's rights that any person has written. It says that not only the vote, which had just happened, women now had the right of franchise. He said the issue is the right of procreation, to control their own procreation. And he said something that seems very harsh, but in a way it had great truth to it. He said, only at the sacrifice of intelligence and the chance to do their best work can the majority of modern women bear children. He gave a choice to women that was quite stark, but it was a choice that was based upon the economics of their situation. And in that area, he had much to say about the African American family and its fragility and what have you. The damnation of women is so inclusive of the problem of women and men and economics to be really a flagship document. It was inspired by Anna Julia Cooper, who was a feminist African American. Her voice from the South, which called women to take charge of their destiny. Charlotte Perkins Gilman, Women in Economics, a major socialist document influencing women. And it was also, and finally, a necessary introduction to Margaret Sanger and birth control. And so all of those things in The Damnation of Women were so inspiring and analytically so much a pathway to women's progress, that you would have to applaud this man for his wisdom. On the other hand, though, there is the Victorian or Edwardian Du Bois. Du Bois has a kind of Victorian probity that oftentimes misleads him in terms of his dealings with his own intimates. His wife, interestingly enough, was the Darkwater collection of essays was dedicated to her, to Nina. And yet I find and found nowhere ever any evidence that Nina had read The Damnation of People, The Damnation of Women. I found that her own self-abnegation was so profound that you would understand that Du Bois would stray away and find companionship with those women who had read The Damnation of Women and who were abiding by its precepts. And so that's a pity indeed. I think, though, he somehow redeems himself in that the women he described as the women of the future found themselves so obliged by his great spirit and his empathy and his encouragement. And there are so many. The first woman to graduate from the University of Pennsylvania in economics, the first woman to become a pediatrician from the medical school of Cornell. The list goes on and on and on. And these women, looking at Du Bois, found that he was a sensitive soul who echoed exactly their aspirations. And so they appreciated him so deeply, and therefore spoke of him as a great feminist, as the avatar of female rights. And yet, at the same time, there were judgments made about the daughter, judgments made about the granddaughter, judgments made indeed about his own wife that compromise this great thinker, in that one is tempted to say that his modernity was terribly, terribly compromised by his Victorianism and his insistence that his own family, whatever the sacrifice, represent the race. And sometimes to be told by one's father that one was to represent the race when she is rather lonely in a British boarding school that Ramsay MacDonald, the Prime Minister of England, has made possible for her education, might say, "Dad, would you read my letter and send me something?" But no, that is simply, I think, an aspect of greatness that you have to accept with the flaws.
Our heroes have feet of clay sometimes in certain areas, and I think we all appreciate the humanity that you brought to the sensitivity to showing him as a full human. He obviously loved his family deeply, even though from our perspective, he might have made choices that we would question, but we weren't in that time and we weren't, in his shoes and didn't.
Christina, I don't understand how he got as much done as he did with, with all the relationships. And we read him and go, please just send a letter. You send a letter to everyone. Send a letter to your daughter, to your wife, to your daughter. He was definitely a man of his times, a Victorian era where the family had to sacrifice themselves to the movement, which is, that's hard. It's harsh. No judgment. So as my daughter says, don't be judgy, Daddy.
Can you speak with us a little bit more about how 21st century efforts to study issues like environmental racism benefited from the sociological frameworks that Du Bois established in his early fieldwork.
Du Bois is noted for writing the Philadelphia Negro, and I just want to say a little more about that in a second. But at the same time, Du Bois created at Atlanta University this Yankee school that insisted that all races were welcome and that had a faculty made of whites and blacks and others. There at Atlanta University, he founded the Atlanta University conferences. And each year there was a major conference. In 1905, the 10th conference brought the issue of the Negro family, and many people came, experts, to comment and adduce their opinions about the African American family. In the next year, 1906, Franz Boas came to speak and introduced for the first time for Du Bois, who thought his education was really sublime, the history of Africa and its peoples. And this will be the basis for a departure ongoing later and some wonderful discoveries of his writings about that subject. But the Atlanta conferences were ignored by the academic mainstream, so much so that Du Bois realized that he was, in a sense, an albatross to his university. It was being denied the money that otherwise should have come to it simply because he was addressing issues that had to do with race relations and with the corrective modalities possible to improve race relations. And that was a no-no in his time at Atlanta University. However, the evidence and the writings on the Negro family, on the Negro businessman, on the Negro scholar, on the Negro laboring class, all of those things will, as the years go by, rise up and influence the whole Du Boisian gestalt of what employment, what wages, what justice, what all those things mean in terms of retardation of Black people. And so if one were to ask what his impact was, it was that by the 1930s, and even before, there is an assembly of scholarship that shows that race is indeed a construct of economics, that indeed race is not, with even the admissions that he would make from time to time that were somewhat awkwardly patronizing, perhaps, about African American sexuality, African American, he would even say, indolence and what have you. Nonetheless, the real takeaways were always that people behave and perform as they can in the situations offered to them. And that if the situations are denial, and if the situations are discrimination, then you get a pathology that you can justify racism with. But he explained that, on the other hand, taking examples, for example, in the Philadelphia Negro, where he, in the 7th Ward, had walked door to interview thousands of African Americans in order to describe their hardships and their aspirations and the unfairness that befell them so often, and yet the possibility of ascent. And so, for the first time, indeed, in the Philadelphia Negro, he used two terms. he used the talented tenth, and then he used the bottom tenth. And there in between, you had African Americans that Philadelphia sociologists had really not thought much about. And they were the people who had moved up, though not to the top, and would not get to the top, perhaps because of their occupational advantages already were disappearing by the immigration of new people who monopolized the public transportation or who began to monopolize barbering or who began to monopolize cuisine and what have you. And all of those things as they happened, he describes. And so you see a movement that can be aspirational at the same time migration and immigrants are beginning to have an impact that is quite problematic.
How did Du Bois's move from academia to media and organizing presage the exploding power of 20th century media to move the Overton window and change the conversation about politics, about inclusion, about policy change?
Yes, as I understand, it is the platform on which ideas are accepted. They can be left or right, but they are reasonable positions on the problems of society. Well, the ignoring of the African American was as common as apple pie until recent times. Today, as were it not that certain things have just happened to condemn diversity, equity, and inclusion, we would have said that you cannot ignore people of color. You cannot ignore the problems of migrants, of immigrants. You cannot ignore social problems. However, it's Du Bois in major manner who will complicate the issue of this Overton moment by showing the economics that benefit demographically one group, however, impede another, and all of it is part of a cocoon, as it were, of ideas that need the implication of and the absorption of ideas that come from Du Bois's metrics, from the Atlanta University conferences, from the Philadelphia Negro, or indeed from his great book, Black Reconstruction in America, in which we see that it is not that, as he once said, the problem of the century is race or racism. He will soon amend that to say the problem of racism, which is embedded, is to be understood as the problem of the manipulation of capital to exploit and use race in order to make it an issue that indeed is artificial.
When he moves and is writing in the crisis, defining what should be debated publicly, where should the debate even lie, does that generate a whole new conversation in the Black community, the white community, the civil rights movement, moving into the 20s and the 30s and the period during the war, where people are willing to engage with ideas about integrationism in the armed forces or things like that, that would not have been even part of the consideration in a previous period because of his writing, because of his bringing these possibilities into people's conversations.
Indeed, I think that's true. And mind you, his contributions are not solitary. They have allies. They have many, many people who are marching with him and articulating and echoing the ideas that his writings propound. One of the things that he wished to have happen was an encyclopedia of the Negro. And this idea came to him early on. And then in the 1930s, he proposed foundation support from the new Carnegie Foundation and other foundations to underwrite with a great gaggle of brilliant social scientists the work that would result in the Negro Encyclopedia. That idea will migrate to Africa when he leaves, and it becomes the Encyclopedia Africana. But he was so determined to birth that encyclopedia that he became an embarrassment to the great foundations. He wrote to scholars throughout the planet who responded positively and said, yes, for heaven's sake, let's study this problem of race. Let's get to it. And so finally, a moment had to be decided between the General Education Board, which benefited from the great wealth of the Rockefeller family, and the Carnegie Foundation, which also was well funded. And indeed, at the last moment, when an interesting moment indeed comes to Du Bois in his office at Atlanta University in the mid-1930s, with a colleague, the brilliant African-American historian Rayford Logan, who had just joined the Atlanta University faculty. And they're waiting for the phone call from the General Education Board saying there's money, $200,000 to finance this enterprise. And at the end of the day, the beaker of champagne warms, no phone call comes, and it looks like it's not going to happen. He's determined, however, to make it happen. It will not, but it lives on in Africa with the important work of the Encyclopedia Africana, and also in the reaction of the foundations that, having denied perhaps Du Bois the purview of deciding what social science, good social science is, they will themselves have to find parallel studies by others, including, for example, the major study that perhaps replaced Du Bois's opportunity, and that was the Gunnar Myrdal great work of race that was to appear shortly after Du Bois was denied. And so you could say it would have been good if Du Bois had done that, but we'll take the best we can get with a pertinent, probing document about race in America.
It just seems like there were strong armed forces to ensure that because they had all the money, the foundations had all the money. The GE was a General Education Board, and there was another one. What was the other?
Carnegie.
Yeah, Carnegie. All these places where the money flowed from, they made sure the money didn't flow to him and Atlanta University. And then, of course, he gets pressure from Atlanta University saying that you're talking too much. They won't give us money because you're here. What's the difference between what's happening today with the strong arm tactic happening in universities and our federal government and what was happening back then for W.E.B. Du Bois? There was one study he did, and they said, no, we're not going to use that, and tore it up.
The Lowndes County study, which is the most remarkable study of its time in 1905, 1906, he was able to persuade the Commissioner of Labor and the man who ran the United States Census to appropriate a good $2,000 to conduct research in Lowndes County, Alabama. And Du Bois went, and within 6 months, he had interviewed 25,000 of the 31,000 Black farmers in Lowndes County. Not only had he done that and reported back to the commissioner and to the Sense director, but they said, this is such good work. We are persuaded that we're going to place at your disposal 2 white researchers who can do the same thing with the white community. And Du Bois says, that's really quite wonderful. And indeed, his design is, in another year, to have produced a report that shows all the mechanics and all the sociology and all the economics of landholding in this one county. And it will show that it is so inflected by race that this county, with its land ownership very, very modest for Black people, is a consequence of these findings. And there he reports and sends it in, and the Commissioner of Labor says, you have made mistakes. And so Du Bois spends about a year or more correcting these so-called mistakes. And then he's told, no, we're not going to use it. And unfortunately, it was the only copy. And so Lowndes County stands out as sociology that would have been of a great benefit to the community, academic, and the larger community. But it is simply something he can write about, we don't have the benefit of. And so your point, Courtney, is certainly painful to appreciate. And indeed, there's a slight awkwardness to have to remember that this Atlanta University, which found that it was denied the beneficence of the great wealth, the philanthropists, is in 1929 abolished. And Atlanta University becomes a graduate school. And the reason for that was that even with the difficulties of Du Bois's presence there on its faculty, the faculty and students ate together, white students, Black students, and by 1929, the absurdity in terms of the status quo of the South by that time was so ironclad that the decision was made to promote this to a graduate school and then to have secondary education that would be uniquely and only Black. That was an example of even the limits of great wealth to change habits in the South not being able to do so. The Rockefeller General Education Board would have realized that finally the adamant racism of the South would have compelled it to pack up and leave much of the South. Indeed, it did not. It quite cleverly reinvented another institution, and at the same time denied the logic of that institution in that it was to have had a law school attached to it. However, as this scholar found in the archives of the General Education Board, there was the document that said, no, we're going to have a school of sociology, not a law school. And so the African American community is without the trained lawyers, except for one at Howard and soon another. But the decision making there is illustrative of the way in which things are baked in solid clay.
Nicely put.
W.E.B. Du Bois was a true pioneer in civil rights. He didn't have a roadmap. He was figuring out everything as he went along. What are the most important lessons we can take today from his successes and his failures?
May I read something he said? It's the epigraph of the second volume. It comes from the autobiography, a soliloquy on viewing my life from the last decade of its first century. He will soon be dead. Had it not been for the race problem early thrust upon me and enveloping me, I should have probably been an unquestioning worshiper at the shrine of the established social order into which I was born. But just that part of this order, which seemed to most of my fellows nearest perfection, seemed to me most inequitable and wrong. And starting from that critique, I gradually, as the years went by, found other things to question in my environment. He would have said, I think, that knowledge is the key to wisdom. He would have said that political courage is the given necessity of democracy. And he would have said that ultimately, the science that tells us that genetically we are all pretty much the same must indeed be appreciated as a social fact that has to lead to policies that advance people irrespective of their color or class, to be sure.
Du Bois used the language and morality of Christianity in his writing, even though his personal history with faith was complicated. Do you think this was mostly strategic, or do you think some of the tenets of his early Congregationalist training became part of his public personality?
I think that's a good question because his New England background is always with him. He makes judgments that a hidebound old Dutchman up in New York or Massachusetts would make. He believes that right is the consequence of knowledge and of courage and of ethics, certainly. And that's a good combination, I think, any day, any time, anywhere, any century. The congregational minister in Atlanta, the first congregational church that was created after the 1906 riot in Atlanta, that awful political and economic pogrom, he said, that minister, who also was from the North, and he said about the ideological tensions between Booker T. Washington and Du Bois, something rather interesting. He knew them both well. Du Bois could have been a member of his church, but Du Bois preferred to stay on the west side of the city. But he showed up from time to time with his new daughter, as a matter of fact. Everyone oohed and awed when Yolande was presented to the congregation. He said, this minister, that every movement has two wings. You have a right wing, and that's absolutely important, and you have a left wing, and that's absolutely important. And he said, I am very comfortable with the advantage that two wings are flapping all the time over my people. And that is perhaps useful to complement what was just said about Booker Washington. He was a victim of the circumstance of location. he himself tried his best occasionally to prevent the exclusion of African Americans from the voting rolls, and got no thanks for that at all, and realized that he better not repeat himself on that score. However, it was true that opportunity is defined in ways that you optimize, and Booker Washington did indeed provide employment for African American academics and for the great numbers of students who attended Tuskegee and Hampton as well. When the situation in the Congo had become quite concerning to progressive people, and some students said, yes, yes, there is Mr. Shangi, who has taken out of the Congo part of the Katanga, which is so rich in minerals, and he's terrible. He's another Booker Washington. And Du Bois was there at the Chancellor's mansion, Connor Cruz O'Brien, the great Chancellor of the first Chancellor of the University of Ghana. And Du Bois said, no, 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 young man, just a moment. No, Booker Washington was not Chambé. Booker Washington was not someone who took Katanga away from his people. Booker Washington was someone who lived in a time in which the bargain that he proposed already was impossible for him to optimize or to facilitate. He was a prisoner of his time. And he went on to say, and my aunt always used to say to me, you have to appreciate how Booker T. Washington is able to finagle and accomplish anything below the Mason-Dixon line. You have had a wonderful opportunity in Great Barrington with your classmates and your teacher, all encouraged you. Booker Washington was a different animal. So I think that's useful to keep that perspective. Today, I think we agree that for voting rights and for the way the world works, Du Bois was on the side of a possible history, and Booker T. Washington was on the side of a history that was a lost cause.
That was a lot of grace.
Oh, man. Just reading it, the Christina and I were just, sometimes we just had to throw our heads back and just go, but why? I mean, it was just sometimes it got so overwhelming, because we look to leaders to lead us. And the manipulation that was happening behind the scenes was just so. And as Christina said, they were flying without a net. There was no, there was no roadmap. They were operating in the dark.
Yes, I think that's a description of the path they trod. And when I learned that we were going to be involved in this project, thanks to you, Courtney, I said, this will be an opportunity for one of the great colossi of the 20th century to be appreciated at the very moment when everything we thought was possible has vanished. When the entire global arrangement since 1945 has been dismembered, and a curious kleptomaniac out of the mob, as it were, has made so much irreparably destroyed. And that means, it seems to me, that Du Bois, with his mistakes, Du Bois, with his great wisdom, is a voice to hear at a time in the next year and a half when this country will either be irreparably transformed in a way that perhaps will impact people of color, even in ways frightening to anticipate, or the excesses will finally rebound to the disgust of enough people that something like the courts and something like economic sense and medical service and social security and all the things that Franklin Roosevelt thought were necessary and that we have lived with, and two or three very large universities having spent their endowment to fight the good fight will still be around, and we can get back to some sort of business. Not though as an American only. The problems of climate, which Du Bois you could see in his metrics and his concerns, an appreciation for the way in which the poor always subject to changes of atmosphere that are greater than those who have some wealth. But it will have to be a global phenomenon. Climate now is our fate, and it goes beyond. One day, either we live up to the challenges or we won't be here. And the planet will continue. A different species, ants or what have you, will be around. There are no guarantees that we have now reached the point where dangers of climate chaos are just about irreversible. And that will force us to some extreme and curious attempts at solution. But we're not even there yet, as we hear the mantra, keep digging, dig, dig, dig.
I wonder if both of you could speak a little bit about what it means to have this Pulitzer Prize winning work in audio. To have Courtney bring your words to a new audience, to a new moment that's very different than the moment in which you originally wrote the book.
I'll speak to it first because I'd like Doc to have the last word. But I read more now than I ever have in my life. And I love biographies. And because it's an opportunity for me to go through time period, to revisit time periods, again and again, because they all overlap. I just finished Washington, the biography of Cherno's Washington, which overlapped somewhat with Hamilton, which overlaps. I read the Jonathan A. Ickes King, and then the Lincoln biography. I can't remember the biographer's name, recent biography. Of course, David Blight's Frederick Douglass, which dovetails over with W.E.B. Du Bois, and so it's just and it just over and over again. They show me how time periods change, technology changes, but Christina and Dr. Lewis, people don't change. We have these people on pedestals, and the cherry tree with Washington. Washington was a man, and he was a man of his time, but he really, really, these men and women are passionate about, that he neglected himself. Washington neglected his family. He neglected, W.E.B. Du Bois neglected his family. All these people neglecting themselves for a greater good. I'm very, very excited and happy for folks to be able to potentially, to revisit something that David did to change lives then, and hopefully and prayerfully change lives today.
I had not been a listener of books. My partner, who I lost recently, always did. And she would say, you're missing out on a whole universe. And I now know that is going to be true. And I think it is true that COVID and a number of things have impacted the way in which we used to deal with knowledge. I think that the digitalization of so much speeds up the need to have answers, and the messaging that everybody does affects the kind of sentence structure that used to be clauses and go on and on. All of that now is becoming more and more essentialized. And so I think that with your voice for the first volume and the second volume, this is transformative. It is transformative, and it happens to be Du Bois. And Du Bois, many people don't know. They know, yes, that he's a public intellectual, and they know that he wrote lots of books. Indeed, the current generation, uh, many, irrespective of color, find that even the souls of Black folk is a bit of a challenge. But to hear those uh, ideas in their appropriateness, in their saliency, and in their existential immediacy, I think will be a gift that you and I have given to the public that we should be quite humbled. And Christina, your questions as well. Recently, I believe you also contributed your voice to what is to be called Rebel with a Cause, a biopic done by Rita Coburn of the life and times of Du Bois. And those two things out there may allow young people to say, well, look, listen to Vance talking about Du Bois. Listening, go and see that biopic. And as the world gets darker and harder and crazier and less beneficent, we may be pioneers of something that we'll be proud of ourselves to be. Thank you.
Oh, Doc, thank you so much. Christina?
Thank you. It has been such an honor to work on this project, and I am so grateful for your deep research into this life to give us we stand on the shoulders of giants, and W.B. Du Bois is absolutely, someone who was dealing with the same problems we're dealing with now. And so learning about his approaches, his strategies, his successes and failures can only motivate us to look to the future with, realism and a certain degree of, you know, um, of skepticism about the political structures that we live inside of, but also with hope, I think, because he brought so much new thinking to a country that at the time of his birth would not have considered the questions that he forced into the public debate by the end of his life. And Courtney brought all of that work to life with such grace and humanity.